If you told anyone 100 years ago that the British Empire would collapse so quickly, they would have laughed. Rome, China, Mongolia, and other great powers of the past endured much longer. But everyone somehow forgets that, at the height of Britain's power, 1 in every 4 people on the planet lived in its empire. And the most remarkable thing is that this occurred not in ancient times when historians often recorded what they imagined, but in the relatively modern 20th century, when manipulations with statistics became less common. And over the British Empire in a literal sense, the sun never set, with its borders stretching across all continents and time zones. It was a technological, social, and economic leader. Yet the British Empire is gone. What makes Britain's fall unique is that, unlike other great nations of the past, its collapse was not accompanied by military defeat. Egypt was conquered 3 times, Rome fell to barbarians, Byzantium to crusaders, yet Britain won 2 world wars, and at one point stood as a bulwark against Hitler in Europe. From a historical perspective, the fall of Britain is truly unique, so let's delve into it. The first challenge we face is one similar to Egypt's, pinpointing when the empire truly disappeared. Officially, it ended on June 30, 1997, when Britain, with the participation of Prince Charles, ceded sovereignty over Hong Kong, one of its last and certainly most economically important colonies, to China. Setting aside the fact that even today Hong Kong competes under its own flag at the Olympics, which is another story, we have other issues to consider. For one, by 1997, Britain could hardly be called an empire. Its GDP was half the size of Germany's, its territory was 3 times smaller than France's, and its currency fared worse on the world market than the Chinese yuan. So, let's continue. We're going back to 1707, when the Act of Union, signed by Queen Anne on May 1, officially proclaimed Britain as an empire. To be precise, it was the Second Empire. The first one lasted for 100 years and had modest achievements. The experiment with licensing pirates led to the establishment of Jamestown in the United States, the village of St. George in India, and a few slave trading posts in West Africa. By and large, the slave trade was the only thing that made the First British Empire profitable. It couldn't be considered a hegemon in terms of territory or economy. But the Second Empire? Very much so. During the War of the Spanish Succession, in the early 18th century, the aforementioned Queen Anne did an impressive job. Britain gained footholds in South America, settled in Ceylon, and surpassed other countries in trade within India. Slaves, of course, remained a key element of the empire's economy, and the trade in the U.S. flourished. However, until the early 19th century, Britain's economic trajectory resembled the flat line of a dead man. As we mentioned in the video on the American Revolution, the loss of the U.S. had little economic impact on Britain simply because it was a suitcase without a handle, a burdensome and unprofitable colony. But, looking at the same economic data, we can see when things started to change and when Britain's remaining colonies became more profitable, or when the suitcases were fitted with handles. This shift occurred around, marking the emergence of Britain as a true global hegemon, with territories spanning the coasts of India, Australia, South Africa, and Canada. The sun truly never set on the empire, and here we confront the first stereotype. Britain didn't initially become rich because of its colonies. Take a look at the inventors of the steam engine, the reflector telescope, the marine chronometer, the hydraulic press, and other innovations. Spoiler, they were all British. Britain was the first to enter the Industrial Revolution and fully capitalized on its benefits, with the key to its success lying in its naval power. No one had ships as large as the British. They secured every trade route in the world and acquired new colonies as an appetizer. But the most important thing the British did was learn from past mistakes. They stopped taking on burdensome colonies, like the United States, that didn't benefit the empire. Each new colony was profitable. India was managed by the East India Company. The colonization of Africa was backed by the Rothschild family's capital, and the Suez Canal was officially purchased. China, too, was officially visited for the opium trade by merchants not directly tied to the British government. And all of this was done under groundbreaking laws for that era. The British enjoyed a monopoly on raw materials in the colonies, concentrated manufacturing in the metropolis, and voila, cheap raw materials and expensive manufactured goods were exported. The colonies, naturally, became eager buyers of British goods. Much can be debated about the morality of such policies, but in the 19th century, Britain's approach was adopted by nearly everyone. You can only fault the empire for doing what everyone else wanted to do, but better. As a result, India and Australia were fully annexed. Half of Africa became British. British Canada thrived as much as the United States. And British Guiana in South America became the main supplier of sugarcane to Europe. There's a separate story about China. But suffice to say, Britain controlled the entire opium market there. After 3 opium wars and taking advantage of their naval superiority, they secured Hong Kong. Following the First World War, as a victor, Britain also took control of Germany's former colonies. By 1920, the empire seemed unshakable. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency, holding a 50% share of global currency markets. And then came Egypt's independence in 1922, Canada's independence in 1931, India's independence in 1947, the withdrawal from Palestine in 1948, Kenya's independence in 1952, Sudan's independence in 1956, and Ghana's independence in 1957. When Elizabeth II was crowned in, she still presided over an empire with 70 overseas territories. She had 14. The largest of these was the Falkland Islands, which is smaller than Montenegro. This timeline cracks the story that the empire ended in 1997 because by that year, the empire had effectively disappeared from the map some 30 years earlier. Most historians now agree that the real collapse of the British Empire should be considered 1947, with the loss of India. India, known as the jewel in the crown of the British monarchy, has since surpassed Britain in terms of GDP, a title it earned for a reason. And now, we finally arrive at the main question: how did this happen? Britain's situation is unique. Not only was it never conquered, but it began to fall apart almost immediately after reaching its peak in 1920. The answer to this question, of course, can't be fully explained in a short video. But, in brief, it's very simple. Britain's industry and economy both built the empire and dismantled it. Often, the decline of Britain leads to discussions about independence movements, idealism, and the spirit of human unity. But all of that fades when faced with a simple fact: India had fought for independence for half of the 20th century without success. And yet, in 1947, when the struggle had almost subsided, it was suddenly granted independence. At that time, India was dealing more with internal religious conflict than with Britain. The empire simply couldn't afford, economically or militarily, to restore order in the country, so it granted India independence. And the problems started much earlier. In 1913, Britain produced 7.8 million metric tons of steel, while Germany produced 17.6 million. During World War I, Britain built 58,000 airplanes and France built 67,000. Even the most popular tank of the conflict was the French Renault FT, although tanks as a concept were invented by Britain. However, Britain produced 3 times fewer of its Mark IVs. All this indicates that the technological gap had collapsed. Countries that lagged during the Industrial Revolution had caught up and reduced the gap. Germany was no longer intimidated by British ships and quietly sank them with its U-boats. France, after 2 centuries of lagging behind, became a leader in the automobile industry and a trendsetter in science. Everything might have been fine, but the United States woke up, a country that, unlike the others, did not participate in World War I at all, but lent and supplied materials to all parties involved in the conflict until it became clear who would win. It was here, just after World War I, that the fate of the British Empire was sealed. There's not much romance in our harsh world, and freedom movements existed as far back as the 19th century. It's just that, at that time, Britain's competitors were hopelessly technologically backward, and the empire's line infantry easily spread the crown's influence anywhere in the world. World War I showed that Britain no longer held industrial or financial dominance, and it was only a matter of time before it ended. Although there were, of course, some frankly unsuccessful decisions made by the empire itself, such as the Dardanelles operation in 1915, when Winston Churchill decided it would be a good idea to push the Ottoman Empire out of the war. He squared off and sent 500,000 troops, including those from Australia and New Zealand, to Istanbul. Only half of them returned home in good health, while Mustafa Kemal became a national hero of Turkey by brilliantly repelling the attack. In the end, Britain won World War I, but from a military standpoint, it performed quite averagely, discouraging many inhabitants of the crown from wanting to defend it. Reparations from Germany might have allowed Britain to intervene early and stabilize the situation, but with the Treaty of Versailles, the Entente imposed such harsh conditions on Germany that the country plunged into crisis and was unable to pay anyone. While France still enjoyed territorial gains, Britain sank deeper into debt, which ultimately led to World War II. The shattered empire performed well, of course, but by 1941 it was hopelessly lagging in production, not only compared to its neighbors but also to the USSR, Japan, and, in some areas, even Italy. 63% of the entire American Lend-Lease program went to assist the British Empire. After the conflict, the British metropolis was physically unable to maintain its colonies. But again, this is the endgame of history. In fact, the simple disadvantage Britain faced compared to other states played a role. And Britain couldn't come up with anything innovative for a new breakthrough. However, few people thought of such things at all. The financial systems and corporations of most countries on the planet still operate on the British model. It's just that Britain itself, at the start of the 20th century, was a bit unlucky. Well, that's all for now. Leave your suggestions for the next topics in the comments. See you again, friends!